one distinctive feature of Jewish religious practice was their exclusive devotion to one God, known by the sacred name Yahweh. This belief and devotion to Yahweh is ordinarily called Jewish monotheism. But the concept of monotheism is hotly contested, and whether monotheism adequately describes the religion of ancient Israel or the Jews of the Second Temple period is also a matter of scholarly discussion. The debate over Jewish monotheism is important because Jewish devotion to their national deity provided both a context and a constraint for early Christology. How the first Christians thought of Jesus as divine was determined by both the meaning and limits of Jewish monotheism. Now, on the one hand, devotion to one deity was not unique to the Jews, as pagan versions of monotheism were known in Antiquity, especially in ancient Egypt, even if these sorts of monotheisms were exceptional rather than the norm. But on the other hand, Jewish exclusive devotion to Yahweh, combined with their rejection of visible representations of the deity and their prohibition of worshipping other gods, that certainly stood out to Greek and Roman observers of the Jews and their religious practices. That is why we must look at whether ancient Jews were actually monotheists, and if they were in some sense monotheists, then how strict was that monotheism? Hi, I'm Mike Bird, and welcome to another episode of the Nazareth to Nicaea podcast and vodcast. And in the next two episodes, we're going to be looking at Jewish monotheism and its relevance for the study of early Christology. The first problem is the word monotheism itself. According to most dictionaries, monotheism is usually defined as belief in the existence of only one God, a God who is metaphysically distinct from both mortals and matter. Yet the word monotheism was first coined by the Cambridge Platonist Henry More in the 1600s, and monotheism is one of the many isms that emerged and became popular in the 18th century. What most people call monotheism in their minds is usually the product of a romantic and rationalistic conception of a single solitary deity. And that conception, that modernist idea of a single deity, is then read back into the religion of the ancient Israelites. The second problem is that it's widely recognized that ancient Israelite religion was not originally, if ever, a monotheistic religion, whereby Israel's God was the only God there was. I mean, even in the Hebrew Bible, you find references to Yahweh as the Lord of hosts, or Yahweh as God of gods, which kind of proves that there are other deities out there, even if they are inferior to Yahweh. Even the forceful pronouncements you get in Isaiah, like, besides me, there is no God, those are more rhetorical than absolute statements. And this explains why someone like even the Apostle Paul, he can say that there are many gods and many lords. He can refer to the God of this age, the rulers of this age, or talk about various powers and principalities in the spiritual realm. The ancient universe for ancient people was populated by a myriad of gods. There were the eternal gods, there were younger gods, there were demigods, there were spirits, demons, even deified mortals. For Jews, Christians, their God was certainly supreme, but their God was not solitary, because below God, there was another class of gods, lesser gods, angels, demons, and the like. So Jews, Christians, and sometimes even pagans, they saw God as being the most high deity, sort of presiding over this divine pyramid, or what we might call a celestial monarchy. Consequently, modern ideas of an absolute metaphysical monotheism, where God is the single and solitary divine being, do not correspond to ancient Jewish or Christian beliefs of their God among other gods, or one God with a big G with other gods with a little g. It's no wonder then that scholars such as Peter Heyman and Paula Fredrickson have advocated for abandoning the term monotheism to describe ancient religion. They don't think that describes either what the ancient Israelites believed or Jews in the Second Temple period. The thing we have to note is that there was a lot of polytheism in the religion practiced by the ancient Israelites. For example, during the monarchical period, several cults existed in Judea besides Yahweh worship, notably those pertaining to Asherah and Baal. Later, during the Persian and Hellenistic period, we have evidence from papyri that shows the Judean garrison in Elephantine in Upper Egypt that they worshipped several deities, several gods, beside Yahweh. Plus, you can even find evidence from the 1st century, BC or CE, where Jews are offering prayers to various deities, thanking some god for a safe journey or for a good business transaction. So it would seem that many Jews, or some Jews, were in fact polytheists. Now, some scholars try to do a hot take on this and talk as if they've covered a massive biblical conspiracy by providing evidence that ancient Jews did not always believe or behave like monotheists. And that's true. In ancient Israel, many Israelites worshipped other gods, which is kind of what the biblical prophets were actually complaining about, which goes to show, certainly before the Babylonian exile, the exilic period, there was a real contest between the worship of Yahweh and the worship of local Canaanite religions. This is a point that Benjamin Summer makes brilliantly. He says this. He says, a depressingly large amount of scholarly writing on this subject consists of attempt to debunk the Bible by demonstrating something that the Bible itself asserts. Indeed, something the Bible repeatedly emphasizes. The Israelites, before the exile, worshipped many gods. How then did the exclusive worship of Yahweh come about? Well, although there were pre-exilic and exilic manifestations of Yahweh alone worship, it was not until the post-exilic period, the Persian and the Hellenistic period, that you really see Jewish monotheism beginning to crystallize. And it crystallizes particularly in the face of Hellenistic pressure for Jews to conform to the religion of the Greeks, the religion of Alexander the Great and his successors, the Seleucids. It's in that context and in that contest that the real sharp edges of Jewish monotheism and its countering effect against Hellenism with its polytheism, it's in that context that Jewish monotheism really comes into effect. In terms of the substance to this exclusive devotion to Yahweh, it's not an abstract or absolute monotheism because, as we saw, there is Yahweh and he is God of gods. He's supreme over other divine beings who are out there. So rather than use the word monotheism, some scholars prefer to refer to this as henotheism, which is precisely that, where you have one God who is head over a family or a tribe of gods or a pantheon of gods. Added to that, when it comes to Jewish worship, some scholars prefer to talk about what's called an AntiIconic Monotheism, which is the exclusive worship of one God without images, without visible representations of deity. That's said to be the essence of Israel's devotion to its one God. According to many scholars, the essential element in Old Testament religion or Israel's devotion to the one God was not a matter of divine ontology or even theology, but mainly the relational aspect. Yahweh was the God who had a relationship with Israel. Yahweh was the God of the patriarchs. Yahweh was the God of the Exodus. Yahweh was the God who gave them the Torah, who brought them into the promised land. Yahweh was the God they worshipped in the temple. Whatever gods there are out there, they're not in relationship with the Israelites. The Israelites have an exclusive relationship with Yahweh, which would suggest that the religion of the Israelites, whatever we call it, monotheism or henotheism, that this is an exclusive relationship. It's a relational type of theism. Now, there's one text I think illustrates this beautifully, and it doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from an extra-biblical source. It comes from the book of Jubilees, which is a type of rewritten Bible. It kind of writes over and summarizes and describes parts of the book of Genesis. And there is a point in Jubilees where Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, offers a prayer. He prays, "My God, the Most High God, you alone are God to me." Now, note that relational aspect. You alone, God to me. Not the only God who is, but the God who has called Abraham to the special task, a relational monotheism. To recap, so far we've seen that monotheism is a modern term. And if monotheism signifies a single and solitary divine being, then it doesn't represent the worldview of the ancients or even the Hebrew Bible. Jewish and Christian belief, and even I think pagan belief of the ancient world, was more like a celestial monarchy where there might be a single God presiding over a hierarchy of lesser divine beings. And some also have argued that Israel's religion, its devotion to Yahweh, might be better described as henotheism with an AntiIconic worship. And some people have also highlighted what seems to be the relational aspect in Israel's devotion to the one God, that Yahweh is the God who has a relationship with Israel. He's called them and made them his own people. And so it would seem that maybe the word monotheism itself has outlived its use-by date. Maybe we should abandon the term monotheism altogether. But then again, to quote Captain Barbosa from Pirates of the Caribbean, I am disinclined to acquiesce to your request. I think maybe we should keep using the term monotheism. Maybe it's not only appropriate, maybe in fact it is actually accurate to use the term monotheism to describe the religion of ancient Israelites and the practice of Jews in the Second Temple period, and as a backdrop to early Christology. Even if Jewish monotheism was not an absolute and abstract theism where Yahweh is literally the only God there is, I think we can still use the term monotheism. I don't think we need to rush to the term henotheism or even find some other alternative, because I do think monotheism can be sustained even if there are other deities and angels and lesser powers floating around. According to Joachim Schapper, the fact that the category of monotheism is indeed a creation of the modern world does not preclude the possibility that it might be a helpful analytical tool for the historian of religion and the biblical exegete, and might rightfully be used in the reconstruction of the history of the Yahwehistic religion from the late pre-exilic period onwards. Similarly, Shaye Cohen, a Jewish scholar, he puts it well too. He says, the Jewish monotheism of antiquity did not exclude belief in many and diverse supernatural beings aside from God. Precisely because the deity had grown so in power and prestige, a need was felt during Second Temple times to populate this intermediate world with beings of all sorts, notably angels. The impulse to believe that myriads of angels served the Lord both in this world and the world above was apparently the belief in God's cosmic majesty. The more exalted God became, the more he required retainers to sing his glory and intermediaries to communicate with the world. Let me add in as well an insight from Richard Borkham, who points out when it comes to Jewish and Christian monotheism, that the real point at stake is not the existence of other divine beings. I mean, that's not the issue. That's not a problem. The real issue is the nature and status of those other beings. The existence of other supernatural entities was not a problem for Jewish monotheism unless they had independent attributes, unless they exercised comparable omnipotence or possessed the attributes of being uncreated and being fully autonomous that were normally ascribed to Yahweh. To throw back to Benjamin Summer for a moment, he wonders why all the fuss about the inappropriateness of the term monotheism, even on technical grounds. Because if you look at Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism and Islam, they all have a very strict view of believing and worshipping one God, but they also believe in other spiritual beings. I mean, they believe there's sort of, hostile gods, there's angels, there's demons, there's martyrs and saints in heaven. But no one calls Catholic and Orthodox Christians henotheists or polytheists, and certainly no one is telling Muslims that they are polytheistic or merely henotheists. And if you can call Christians and rabbinic authors and Muslims, if you can call them monotheists, even though they believe in a populated heavenly hierarchy, well, why not the same for the ancient Israelites? Why not the same for Second Temple Jews? In fact, it sure beats the hell out of explaining the term henotheism to undergrads or trying to pronounce or even spell AntiIconic Monotheism. So how is Israel's God different from the run-of-the-mill deities in antiquity? Well, I think in several ways. To begin with, we're told over and over that God is one. He's the one God of Israel, and there is an interior unity to God. And God has also revealed himself with the distinct name Yahweh by which he is known. God is also the God who delivered the Israelites in the Exodus. He's the God who gave them the covenant, who gave them the Torah. Now, these views were not necessarily unanimous in ancient Israelite religion, but they do crystallize and become ubiquitous in the post-exilic and Hellenistic periods. It is during this Hellenistic period where you get an author such as Philo writing in the first century in Alexandria, and he gives us a very clear and crisp definition of monotheism. And this is what he writes. He says, "Therefore, of first importance, let us inscribe in ourselves this first commandment as the holiest of all commandments, to think that there is but one God, the Most High, and to honor him alone, and do not permit polytheistic doctrine to even touch the ears of any person who is accustomed to seek after the truth with a clean and pure heart." Another Jewish author from the first century, Josephus, he restates the first commandment from the Decalogue in light of the Shema, Israel's basic confession from Deuteronomy 6:4. Josephus says, "The first word teaches us that God is one and he only must be worshipped." Josephus later makes monotheism axiomatic and simply assumed amongst his contemporaries. And he says to recognize God as one is common to all the Hebrews. Perhaps most important of all, though, was that Israel's God was identified as the incomparable, unrivaled, uncreated creator of heaven and earth and everything that is in them. Yahweh then was separate from the world as its creator, whereas the ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman gods, in the majority of cases, they were not the creator of the world. They were the mightiest forces within the world. They did not stand outside the world. In fact, most of the time, the world already existed when they came onto the scene, and the world would even persist long after their departure. Yahweh then was distinct because he was unlike the various gods and angels and demons. He had no rival. He had no equal. He had no competitor. Now, there can be a little bit of blurriness when you've got Yahweh and some of his representatives like the angel of the Lord or the Logos or, the wisdom of Yahweh. I mean, there can be a little bit of ambiguity there. Nonetheless, there is a consistent pattern of insisting that Yahweh was God of gods. And while he's not a single solitary divine being, he was kind of species unique as the creator. And he also had no rivals and no real competitors, no one who could really dethrone him in the pantheon of antiquity. Such a view of Israel's God as the unrivaled and uncreated creator seems to become more predominant during the Hellenistic period. Josephus attributes to Abraham the view that God, the creator of the universe, is one. If any other being contributed anything to man's welfare, each did so by his command and not from his own inherent power. Similarly, Philo states that there is no created Lord, not even shall a king extend his authority and spread it from the edge of the world to its end, except the only uncreated God. Now, Philo is very aware there are what he calls subordinate powers, but they do not compromise God's oneness or compete with his sovereignty, self-existence, or his authorship of creation. In fact, Philo deploys this heavenly hierarchy as something of a teaching device to persuade his readers to seek a more elevated understanding of God and to recognize the ineffable nature of God precisely because he stands and lords it over all of these other heavenly powers. Turning to the 2nd century, looking at the writings of Justin Martyr, his Jewish interlocutor, Trypho, he acknowledged that in Deuteronomy 10, it does speak of Yahweh as God of gods. But Trypho says it's only written this way to emphasize that the true God, the creator of all, is the sole Lord of all those who are falsely regarded as gods and lords. This rejection of idols and worship of only one God was also very apparent and very clear to pagan observers of ancient Judaism. For example, in the Epistle to Aristeas, the Jews stand out as one group who believe that there is only one God and that they were instructed by Moses to worship the one Almighty God over creation. In the case of the Roman author Tacitus, he says the Jews were distinguished in that they acknowledge one God only and conceive of him by mind alone, or some translations refer to a spiritual monotheism. The 2nd century philosopher Celsus, he takes a dig at the Israelites. He calls them a bunch of goat herders and shepherds who were deluded by Moses into thinking there was only one God, and they abandoned the worship of many gods in favor of one God called the Most High. Taken together, I think this creates a picture of what we could call creational and monarchical monotheism. God is the uncreated creator. He has no rival in the heavenly realm. And now that type of Jewish monotheism may not have been uniform everywhere all the time, but it was certainly ubiquitous in the Greco-Roman era. Furthermore, this emphasis on God as one, distinct from both creation and intermediary beings, and alone to be worshipped, was carried over into the New Testament and early Christian literature, where it becomes programmatic for divine discourse and it becomes the backdrop for early Christology. Thus, notwithstanding debates concerning the origins of Yahweh-only theism in ancient Israelite religion, and even allowing for incidents of, syncretism and Jews occasionally engaging in worship rites with their pagan neighbors, we could say that common Judaism was monotheistic to the extent that Yahweh was regarded as the source and sovereign of the heavenly and earthly realms, and was the exclusive recipient of Israel's cultic worship through the temple. So, Jewish monotheism, definitely a contested term, but I think it's not necessarily inappropriate, and perhaps it's worth keeping. In the next episode, we're going to look at the strictness of Jewish monotheism. I mean, it's one thing to define and defend the concept of Jewish monotheism, but exactly how strict was it? Could other beings like angels, exalted patriarchs, or someone like Jesus participate in the very godness of God? Or was that guarded and exclusive? On the other hand, there are those who think, the whole concept of divinity, whether it's Yahweh or a deified human being, it's a pretty flexible category, and pretty much anyone, for a variety of reasons, could wiggle their way onto the divine pyramid and become divine, become a god in some sense. So that's where the discussions of Jewish monotheism will more concretely apply to our discussions of early Christology. But that is for next time. Until then, please share, please like, add a comment or a question, leave a review, and I look forward to seeing you all next time on the Nazareth to Nicaea podcast and vodcast.